Chapter 1. The Party He Never Wanted. The morning of his 90th birthday, John Hart sat in his favorite armchair, the brown leather recliner that had molded itself to his frame over 23 years, and watched his family transform his peaceful living room into what he called a three-ring circus. Streamers appeared across doorways. Balloons multiplied like dandelions after rain. His daughter, Sarah, directed the chaos, with the efficiency of a woman who'd organized church potlucks for 3 decades, while his son, David, hung a banner that proclaimed in cheerful letters, "Happy 90th birthday, Grandpa John." "All this fuss," John muttered, adjusting his glasses to watch his grandson, Tommy, wrestle with what appeared to be enough. Folding chairs to seat half the county. 90 years old, and they act like I've climbed Mount Everest. But John Hart was nothing if not observant, and despite his grumbling, he noticed things. He noticed how Sarah had remembered to buy the coffee cake from Miller's Bakery, the same kind his late wife Margaret had always ordered for special occasions. He noticed how David had positioned the chairs, so John would have clear sight lines to everyone without having to crane his neck, the arthritis in his spine making such movements a daily reminder of time's passage. Most of all, he noticed the way his great-granddaughter, Lila, bounced through the preparations like a hummingbird, her 7-year-old energy making everyone smile despite the chaos. "Grandpa John," she called, practically skipping across the room, with something clutched in her small hands. "I made you something." She presented him with a card that looked like it had survived several revisions, complete with glitter that would probably be embedded in his carpet until Christmas. The front featured what he assumed was meant to be his likeness stick arms, a circle face, and an impressive amount of gray scribbles for hair. Inside, in her careful first-grade penmanship, she'd written, "Happy birthday, Grandpa John. You are the best. Love, Lila." But underneath, in smaller letters that showed she'd taken extra care, was a question that made him pause. "What are 10 things you still want to do?" John looked up from the card to find Lila's bright eyes fixed on his face, with the particular intensity that children reserve for questions they consider monumentally important. "10 things, huh?" he said, his voice softer than it had been all morning. "What makes you think this old bird has 10 things left to do?" Lila tilted her head, considering this with the seriousness of a philosopher. "Mommy says you've done everything, but I think there's always more stuff to do. Like, I want to do 1,000,000 things, so maybe you want to do 10 things. Before John could answer, Sarah called from the kitchen. "Lila, honey, come help me with the sandwiches." The little girl gave John's knee a pat and skipped away, but her question lingered in the air like the scent of fresh coffee, impossible to ignore. 10 things. At 90 years old, what could he possibly have left undone? Chapter 2. A list is born. The party proved to be everything John had expected: too loud, too crowded, and filled with the particular exhaustion that comes from being the center of attention. When you'd rather be reading the newspaper in peace, neighbors stopped by with covered dishes and memories from decades past. Old friends from the hardware store where he'd worked for 43 years shared stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. But through it all, Lila's question echoed in his mind. What are 10 things you still want to do? It was nearly 8 o'clock when the last guest departed, leaving behind a kitchen full of leftover cake and the particular quiet that follows a celebration. John sat in his recliner, feeling oddly deflated, when Lila appeared beside him, with a paper napkin and one of those fat crayons they give to children. "Okay," she announced, settling cross-legged on the carpet beside his chair. "Now we make your list." "Sweetheart," John began, but she held up a small hand, with the authority of someone who'd made many lists in her 7 years. 10 things," she said firmly. "Start with easy ones." And so, with the house settling into evening quiet around them, John Hart began to think about desires he'd buried under decades of routine and responsibility. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose I'd like to have real peach pie again, made from scratch, the way your great-grandmother used to make it." Lila wrote carefully, "1. Peach pie. And I haven't been to the county fair in, must be 15 years now. Used to love the Ferris wheel." 2. Fair wheel. The words came easier then, as if speaking them aloud gave them permission to exist. A ride in a convertible with the top down. One more fishing trip to Cedar Creek. A chance to see the stars from somewhere without streetlights. But then, as Lila's crayon moved across the napkin, something shifted in John's chest. The deeper wishes began to surface, the ones he'd kept locked away, like old photographs in a drawer rarely opened. "I'd like to see the lake again," he said quietly. "Willow Lake, where I met your great-grandmother. Haven't been there since. Well, since we scattered her ashes." Lila's writing slowed. 7. Sea Lake, where you met Grandma Maggie. "And I—" John paused, the words catching in his throat, like autumn leaves in a storm drain. "I'd like to talk to my son Robert again, your grandfather's brother. We haven't spoken in 8 years. The crayon stopped moving entirely. "What happened?" Lila asked, in the whisper children use when they sense they're approaching grown-up sorrows. "Oh, sweetheart," John sighed. "Sometimes grown-ups say things they can't take back. And sometimes we're too proud to try." 8. Talk to Uncle Robert, Lila wrote, her letters somehow smaller, as if she understood the weight of this wish. They continued until the napkin held 10 careful lines, 10 dreams that ranged from simple pleasures to profound reconciliations. When they finished, John folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "There," he said, "your list is complete." "It's not my list," Lila corrected gently. "It's yours." That night, after Lila had been tucked into the guest room bed and the house had settled into sleep, John sat in his kitchen under the warm glow of the lamp Margaret had chosen 30 years ago. He unfolded the napkin and read through Lila's careful handwriting, each item a small act of faith in the possibility that life at 90 could still hold surprises. He was so absorbed in reading that he didn't notice his daughter Sarah standing in the doorway until she spoke. "Dad, is everything all right?" John looked up to find her eyes fixed on the napkin, and he saw the exact moment when she spotted item number 8. Her hand went to her throat, a gesture she'd inherited from her mother, and she drew a sharp breath. "Dad," she whispered. "Robert?" Chapter 3. The family divides. Word of John's list spread through the family, with the particular efficiency of small-town gossip. By the next afternoon, when David stopped by for their weekly chess game, it was clear that opinions were divided. A bucket list, Dad? Really? David moved his knight with the decisive precision he brought to his accounting practice. You're 90 years old. Shouldn't you be thinking about, well, taking it easy? John studied the chessboard, but his mind was on the napkin, now tucked safely in his bedroom drawer. Your move always was the practical one, son. I'm serious, Dad. Some of these things. David's voice carried the particular strain of adult children who've accepted responsibility for aging parents. The lake is 3 hours away. The fair involves crowds and walking, and as for Robert, he didn't finish the sentence, but John heard the rest of it anyway. Robert was a wound that had never properly healed. A son who'd walked away from the family 8 years ago after a fight about money, responsibility, and words that couldn't be unsaid. Sarah, however, saw things differently. She arrived that evening with a grocery bag, and the determined expression she wore when tackling church committee projects. I think it's wonderful, she announced, unpacking peaches that smelled like summer sunshine. When's the last time we saw you excited about anything? She was right, though John wouldn't admit it. For the first time in months, maybe years, he'd woken up that morning with something to anticipate. The list had given him what he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a reason to look forward instead of backward. But the real champion of his cause was Lila. During dinner, as the adults debated the wisdom of elderly adventure, she sat quietly, cutting her chicken into precise squares. Finally, she looked up with the solemn expression children wear when delivering important truths. Grandpa John isn't dead yet, she announced, so maybe he should do stuff while he's still alive. The table fell silent. David opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Sometimes, John reflected, it takes a 7-year-old to state the obvious with the clarity adults spend decades trying to avoid. That night, after the dishes were washed and the family had gone home to their own routines, John sat in his bedroom looking at the list by lamplight. 10 items, some simple, some complicated, all of them requiring a kind of courage he wasn't sure he still possessed. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway or notice the guest room door creak open. It wasn't until he heard the gentle rustle of paper that he realized Lila had slipped into his room and was carefully copying the list onto a piece of notebook paper. "What are you doing, little one?" he whispered. She looked up, crayon poised, completely unashamed at being caught. "Making a backup," she said matter-of-factly. "In case you lose yours. We're going to do every single thing on this list, Grandpa John. I promise." And somehow, looking at her determined face in the lamplight, John believed her. Chapter 4. Small Steps, Big Ripples. The peach pie came first. Sarah arrived the following Saturday morning with a basket of supplies and the particular determination of women who've decided to make something happen. She'd found Margaret's old recipe box in the attic, complete with flour-stained index cards written in the careful cursive of a woman who'd learned penmanship when such things mattered. Mama always said the secret was in the crust, Sarah murmured, reading Margaret's notes. Cold butter, ice water, and patience. John watched from his kitchen stool as Sarah worked, her movements echoing her mother's in ways she probably didn't realize. The way she tested the dough between her fingers, how she rolled from the center outward, the little frown of concentration as she crimped the edges with a fork. When Lila arrived, summoned by the scent of baking peaches and cinnamon, she found John at the kitchen table, with tears in his eyes and the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him in months. "Number 1, she announced, making a careful check mark on her copy of the list. "What's next?" The convertible ride came courtesy of his neighbor Jim, whose red Mustang had been gathering dust in the garage since his wife declared it a midlife crisis on wheels. On a Tuesday afternoon, when the September air held just enough warmth to promise that autumn was still weeks away, John found himself in the passenger seat with the wind in his remaining hair, and Lila squeezed between him and Jim in the front seat. They drove through the countryside where John had grown up, past farms that had been subdivided into housing developments and creeks that now ran under concrete culverts. But when they reached the old covered bridge on County Road 7, Jim pulled over and turned off the engine. "This is where I proposed to your great-grandmother," John told Lila, pointing to a spot where the creek curved around a stand of willow trees, right there on that bank, with the water running over the stones and the sunset turning everything gold. "What did she say?" Lila asked. "She said yes, but only if I promised to take her dancing every Friday night for the rest of our lives." "Did you?" John smiled. "Every Friday for 62 years, sweetheart, right up until her legs couldn't carry her anymore." That evening, when David stopped by to check on his father, he found John sitting in his chair with photo albums spread across his lap and stories spilling out like water from a broken dam. Stories David had never heard about the father he'd known, but somehow never really seen. The county fair proved more challenging. The crowds were overwhelming, the noise exhausting, and John's legs reminded him why he usually preferred his recliner to prolonged walking. But when Lila spotted the Ferris wheel rising against the September sky, like a great glittering compass, her excitement was infectious. "Just one ride," she pleaded. "Please, Grandpa John." And so, John Hart, at 90 years old, found himself strapped into a swaying car 30 feet above the fairgrounds, watching his great-granddaughter point out landmarks with the pure joy of someone seeing the world from a new angle. "There's your house," she called, though John doubted she could actually identify it from this height. "And there's the school, and look, you can see forever from up here." Forever. John thought about that word as they rose to the top of the wheel and paused, suspended between earth and sky. At 90, forever felt both impossibly long and heartbreakingly short. But sitting there with Lila's small hand in his, watching the world spread out below them, like a patchwork quilt made of memories and possibilities, John understood something important. Forever isn't measured in years. It's measured in moments like this one. The list was working its magic in ways John hadn't expected. Neighbors, who'd barely nodded for months, began stopping to ask about his adventures, The mailman lingered for conversations. Even David seemed to soften, bringing his own children around more often, as if John's renewed vitality had reminded the family that he was more than just an obligation to be managed. But the bigger wishes, the ones that required courage rather than just energy, still waited like unopened letters. Then, on a Thursday morning in early October, John retrieved his mail to find an envelope that made his hands shake. His name and address were written in handwriting he hadn't seen in 8 years, but which he'd recognize anywhere. Robert. Chapter 5. Old Wounds Reopened. John sat at his kitchen table for 20 minutes, staring at the envelope as if it might spontaneously combust. The return address was from 2 states away, confirming what John had suspected. Robert had moved without telling anyone in the family where he'd gone. The fight 8 years ago had started over money, as these things often do. Margaret's medical bills in her final months had been staggering, and when she passed, Robert had expected an inheritance that simply wasn't there. The house was mortgaged, the savings depleted, and John faced the reality of a fixed income and mounting debts. "You spent everything," Robert had accused during that terrible argument in the hospital parking lot, his voice carrying across the asphalt like broken glass. 40 years of work, and there's nothing left." "I spent it keeping your mother alive," John had replied, and the silence that followed had been worse than any shouting match. Now, holding the envelope, John remembered every word of that conversation, how Robert's face had hardened. When John explained about the experimental treatments, the private nurses, the desperate hope that one more doctor, one more procedure might give them a few more years together. She was dying anyway, Robert had said. And that's when John had done something he'd never done before. He'd slapped his son across the face. They hadn't spoken since. When Lila arrived after school, she found John still sitting at the table, the unopened letter positioned precisely in the center of the placemat Margaret had embroidered with morning glories. "Is that from Uncle Robert?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him, with the matter-of-fact directness that made her such an effective conspirator. "Yes." "Are you going to open it?" John sighed. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes it's better to leave sleeping dogs alone." Lila considered this with the seriousness she brought to all adult metaphors. "But if it's a sleeping dog, maybe it's having good dreams. And if you wake it up, maybe it'll be happy to see you." The logic was 7-year-old perfect, and John almost smiled, despite the knot in his stomach. "Or maybe," he said gently, "it'll bite." "But you won't know unless you look," Lila pointed out. "That's what you said about the peach pie. Remember? You said we wouldn't know if it tasted like Grandma Maggie's unless we tried." John did remember, and he remembered how the first bite of that pie had brought back Sunday afternoons and birthday celebrations, and the particular way Margaret had hummed while she baked. With Lila watching, John carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, written on plain white paper in Robert's familiar engineer's handwriting. "Dad, I heard about your birthday from Cousin Ellen. 90 years is quite an achievement. I've been thinking about that day at the hospital, about the things we said to each other. I want you to know that I understand now why you made the choices you did. Mom was lucky to have someone who loved her enough to fight that hard. But understanding and forgiving aren't the same thing. I'm not ready to come home yet. Maybe I never will be. I hope you had a good birthday. Robert. John read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. The words weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They were careful, the kind of measured response that keeps wounds from healing, because it won't let them properly hurt. What did he say? Lila asked softly. He said, he's not ready to forgive me yet. John expected Lila to ask what there was to forgive, but she surprised him by simply nodding, as if this made perfect sense. Mama says sometimes people need extra time to not be mad, she said. Like when I was really mad at Tommy for breaking my favorite crayon. I needed 3 whole days to not be mad anymore. This is a little more complicated than a broken crayon, sweetheart. I know, Lila said seriously, but maybe Uncle Robert just needs more than 3 days. That evening, John crumpled the letter and threw it in the kitchen trash. The list had been a mistake, he decided. Some wounds were meant to stay closed. Some bridges were meant to stay burned. He was getting ready for bed when he heard paper rustling in the kitchen. Through the doorway, he could see Lila at the table, with her notebook and one of her fat crayons, writing with the careful concentration she reserved for important work. What are you doing, little one? He called. Writing a letter, she called back, to Uncle Robert. John's heart stopped. Lila, sweetheart, I don't think... It's okay, she interrupted. I know what to say. And somehow, despite everything, John believed her. Chapter 6. The Journey to the Lake. 3 weeks passed before Sarah agreed to drive John to Willow Lake. She'd hemmed and hawed about the distance, the weather, the wisdom of such an emotional journey. But when October painted the countryside in shades of amber and scarlet, and John's quiet persistence finally wore down her practical objections, she loaded her father and Lila into her station wagon for the 3-hour drive. John hadn't seen Willow Lake in 5 years. Not since the day they'd scattered Margaret's ashes from the little wooden dock, where teenagers still came to fish, and young couples came to make promises under the stars. The lake looked smaller than he remembered, the way childhood places always do, when revisited through adult eyes. But the essential magic remained, the way sunlight danced on the water, how the willow trees trailed their branches like fingers, testing the temperature. The particular peace that comes from standing beside water that has witnessed generations of human hopes and sorrows. Tell me about when you met her, Lila said, taking John's hand as they stood at the water's edge. And so John told the story he'd told dozens of times over the decades, but somehow it felt fresh in this place where it had actually begun. How he'd been 17 and working his first real job at Morrison's Hardware. How he'd come to the lake one July evening in 1953 to escape the heat, and his father's expectations. How he'd seen a girl about his own age sitting on the dock, reading a book and ignoring the sunset like someone who had all the time in the world. She was wearing a yellow dress, John remembered, his voice soft with memory, bright as a sunflower. And when she looked up and saw me standing there like a fool, she smiled and asked if I knew anything about fixing the clasp on her grandmother's necklace. Did you? Lila asked. No, John laughed. But I said I did anyway. Spent the next hour fumbling with that tiny clasp, while she told me about the book she was reading and how she was starting secretarial school in the fall, and how she'd rather be a teacher, but her parents thought that was impractical. He paused, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water with the unhurried grace of creatures who understand that the journey is more important than the destination. I never did fix that necklace, he continued, but she kept letting me try. And by the time the stars came out, we'd talked about everything: our dreams, our families, what we thought life might hold for us. When I finally walked her home, I was already planning how I'd see her again. And you got married? Lila prompted, though she knew this part of the story by heart. 2 years later, right here by this lake, with both our families and half the town watching. She looked like an angel in her grandmother's wedding dress, and I looked like a scared boy in a suit that didn't quite fit. Were you scared? John considered the question seriously. Terrified, but not of marrying her. I was scared I might not be worthy of someone that wonderful. Scared I might not love her well enough or long enough. But you did, Lila said with 7-year-old certainty. I tried to, sweetheart. Every single day for 62 years, I tried to love her the way she deserved. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, 3 generations connected by love and loss, and the particular peace that comes from being in a place where important things have happened. Finally, John walked to the end of the dock and knelt carefully on the weathered boards. Sarah moved to help him, but he waved her away with the gentle stubbornness she remembered from childhood. Hello, sweetheart, he said to the water, his voice carrying the intimate tone he'd once used for bedtime, conversations and morning coffee, and the 1,000 small moments that make up a marriage. I brought Lila to meet you. She's Sarah's granddaughter, bright as a penny and twice as curious. She reminds me of you when you were young. He paused, gathering words for things he'd never said aloud. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I was afraid it would hurt too much being here without you. But Lila made me a list, 10 things I still want to do, and seeing this place again was number 7. I should have known you'd still be here, in the way the light falls through the willow branches, and how the water sounds like whispered secrets. His voice caught, and for a moment the only sounds were water lapping against the dock, and the distant call of geese heading south for winter. I miss you, Margaret. I miss your laugh and your terrible singing in the shower, and how you always knew what I needed before I knew it myself. I miss having someone to tell about my day, someone who cared whether the hardware store made a profit or whether Mrs. Henderson's cat found its way home. Lila moved quietly to his side and slipped her small hand into his. But I want you to know, John continued, that I'm trying to live the way you taught me. Me paying attention to the good things, being grateful for what I have, instead of mourning what I've lost. Lila is helping me remember how to want things, how to hope for things. I think you'd like her very much. I would have liked Grandma Maggie, too, Lila whispered, and John squeezed her hand. She would have adored you, little one. She always said children were just adults, who hadn't forgotten how to see magic in ordinary things. Behind them, Sarah quietly lifted her phone and captured the moment, not to share or display, but to preserve this image of her father and granddaughter, connected by love and memory beside the water where it all began. As they prepared to leave, John took one last look at the lake, where his life had truly started. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and copper. That would have made Margaret catch her breath in delight. "Thank you," he whispered, though whether to Margaret, to Lila, or to the lake itself, he couldn't say. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. John dozed in the front seat while Lila worked in her notebook, writing what she called important memories in her careful first-grade cursive. They were 20 minutes from home when Sarah's phone rang. She answered on the car's speaker system, and David's voice filled the cabin. "Sarah, is Dad with you?" "We're on our way back from the lake," Sarah said. "Why? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," David said, and John could hear something like wonder in his son's voice. "But there's someone here waiting to talk to Dad. Someone I haven't seen in 8 years. John's eyes flew open, and in the rearview mirror, he could see Lila grinning with the particular satisfaction of someone whose plan has worked exactly as intended. Chapter 7. The Hardest Conversation. Robert was standing on the porch when they pulled into the driveway, looking older and grayer than John remembered, but unmistakably his son. He wore a blue windbreaker and the expression of someone who'd driven a long way to have a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted. John climbed out of the car slowly, his knees protesting after the long drive, and faced the son he hadn't seen in 8 years. Neither man moved toward the other, but neither looked away. "Hello, Dad," Robert said finally. "Hello, son." The words hung in the evening air, like leaves waiting to fall, full of weight and the potential for either breaking or landing softly. Lila, however, had no patience for adult hesitation. She marched up the porch steps and looked Robert up and down with the frank assessment children bring to meeting new people. "You look like Grandpa John," she announced, "but sadder." "Are you Uncle Robert?" "I am," Robert said, and his voice was gentler than John had expected. "I wrote you a letter," Lila continued. "Did you get it?" "I did. That's why I'm here." John looked at his great-granddaughter with new eyes. "What did you write to him, sweetheart?" Lila shifted from foot to foot, suddenly shy. "I told him about your list and about how you wrote his name on it, which means you still love him even though you had a big fight. And I told him that sometimes when people you love go away, you have to be the first one to say you're sorry, even if you don't think it's all your fault." She paused, looking between the two men with the solemn expression she wore when delivering particularly important information. "And I told him that Grandpa John is 90 years old, which means he might die soon. And if that happened and Uncle Robert never got to say goodbye, he'd be sad forever. Like forever and ever sad." The silence that followed was the kind that contains entire conversations, all the accusations and explanations and justifications that had been rehearsed in sleepless nights and long drives. "She's got a point," Robert said finally. and John thought he heard the ghost of a smile in his son's voice. "She usually does," John replied. Sarah herded David and the children inside, leaving father and son alone on the porch. With 40 years of history and 8 years of silence between them, they sat in the wooden chairs Margaret had chosen for this porch, positioned so visitors could watch the street and neighbors could wave as they passed. John had sat in these same chairs with salesmen and ministers, with friends delivering casseroles during Margaret's illness, with grandchildren showing off school projects and lost teeth. But he'd never sat here with Robert as two grown men trying to find their way back to each other. "I got your letter," Robert said finally. "The one you wrote me last year." John frowned. "I never wrote you a letter. It was from Lila, but she signed it from your dad's little buddy Lila. She told me about the list you made on your birthday, about how you wanted to talk to me again. She's 7 years old," John said, shaking his head in wonder. "Yeah, well, she writes like someone much older, or maybe she just sees things more clearly than the rest of us." Robert pulled a folded piece of notebook paper from his jacket pocket, the kind with the dotted lines first graders use to practice their letters. "She told me about the peach pie and the Ferris wheel, and going to see the lake where you met Mom. She said you talk to Mom sometimes, like she's still there listening. Do you think that makes me a foolish old man?" Robert was quiet for so long that John thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "I think it makes you someone who loved her enough to keep talking, even after she couldn't answer." The words hit John like a physical blow, not painful, but transforming, the way truth sometimes does when it arrives unexpected and perfectly timed. "I should have called," Robert continued. "After Mom died, I should have called to check on you. I was angry about the money, but I was really angry about losing her. And it was easier to be mad at you than to admit I was scared of watching you die too." "I wasn't angry about the money," John said quietly. "I was angry that you thought I'd choose money over your mother's life, that you thought so little of who I am, of who we were together. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but I couldn't. I couldn't let myself be wrong. You know how I am." John did know. Robert had inherited his grandmother's stubborn streak and his grandfather's pride. Pride, a combination that made him an excellent engineer and a difficult son. "The letter from Lila," Robert continued. "She asked me something that's been keeping me awake for weeks." "What's that?" "She asked if I thought Mom would be proud of how I've been acting. If she'd want me to stay angry when you needed family around you." John felt his chest tighten. "And what did you decide?" "I decided," Robert said slowly, "that Mom always said family fights were like storms. They're loud and destructive, but they don't last forever. And after they pass, you either rebuild together or you walk away with nothing." He looked at his father, and John could see Margaret in his eyes, not just the shape or color, but the particular way she'd looked at people she loved, even when they disappointed her. "I don't want to walk away with nothing, Dad." The conversation that followed wasn't neat or comfortable. There were long silences and careful words, and moments when both men looked away, rather than let the other see tears that had been 8 years in the making. Robert talked about the guilt he'd carried, not just about the money, but about all the Sunday dinners he'd missed while building his career, all the phone calls he'd cut short because he was busy with his own life, all the ways he'd taken his parents' presents for granted until it was too late to take any of it back. John talked about the loneliness of Margaret's final months when she'd asked for Robert every day, and John had run out of excuses for why his son couldn't visit. He talked about the fear that he'd failed as a father, that something he'd done or failed to do had driven his son away when life got difficult. "I keep thinking about the list," Robert said, as the evening deepened around them. "All those things you still want to do. It made me realize I have my own list things I've been putting off, conversations I've been avoiding, important things." "Like what?" John asked. "Like telling my father I'm sorry. Like asking if it's too late to start over." "It's never too late," John said, and he meant it with every fiber of his 90-year-old heart. "As long as we're both still breathing, it's not too late." When they finally went inside, they found the family pretending not to eavesdrop, while setting up for what Sarah called a spontaneous dinner party. Lila appointed herself official hostess, introducing Robert to everyone, as if he were a new friend rather than the uncle who'd been absent from birthday parties and Christmas mornings for 8 years. "Uncle Robert," she announced, "this is my mom and dad, and that's my brother Tommy, and this is David, who's your brother, but also Grandpa John's son," which makes it confusing, but also nice because now we have more people for dinner. Robert laughed, actually laughed for the first time since he'd arrived, and John felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't even realized was clenched tight. Dinner was awkward in the way family reconciliations always are, full of careful politeness and conversational landmines everyone tried to avoid. But Lila, bless her 7-year-old heart, treated the evening like any other family gathering, asking Robert about his job and his house and whether he had any pets, as if 8 years of silence were just a brief interruption in an ongoing conversation. It was when they were clearing dessert plates that Lila made her announcement. "Grandpa John," she said, with the formal tone she used for important business, "I think we need to have your real birthday party now." "What do you mean, sweetheart? We had the party last month." "That was the party you didn't want," Lila explained patiently. "But now Uncle Robert is here, and you've finished most of your list, so now we can have the party you do want." John looked around the table at his family, his son David, who'd inherited his practical nature, Sarah, who'd loved him like her own father for 30 years, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who carried pieces of Margaret's smile and his own stubborn chin, and Robert, who'd driven 300 miles because a 7-year-old girl had reminded him that love was stronger than pride. "You know what?" John said, pushing back from the table with sudden decision. "I think Lila's right. I think we do need a real party." Chapter 8. The Final Wish. The real birthday party happened the following Saturday. Not because anyone needed time to prepare. The decorations were still in Sarah's closet from the first party, but because John wanted Robert to stay long enough to really be there, not just present in body, but settled into the family rhythm he'd been missing. The second party was smaller, but somehow more complete. The same neighbors came, the same friends from the hardware store, But this time, John wasn't the reluctant center of attention. This time, he was the host of his own celebration. When everyone had gathered in the living room, squeezed onto couches and folding chairs, and in the case of the youngest grandchildren, cross-legged on the carpet, John stood slowly and raised his coffee cup instead of a champagne flute, because coffee was what Margaret would have served at a Saturday afternoon gathering. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally figured out what he wanted to say. "A month ago, when my family threw me a party, I kept insisting I didn't want. I thought I was too old for surprises, too old for new experiences, too old for lists and wishes and dreams." He looked at Lila, who was sitting on the floor beside his chair, with her notebook open to a fresh page, ready to record whatever important thing was about to happen. "But this little girl asked me a question that changed everything. She asked me what 10 things I still wanted to do, and at first I thought the answer was nothing. What could a 90-year-old man possibly have left undone?" He pulled the original napkin from his shirt pocket, carefully preserved despite weeks of folding and unfolding, and held it up so everyone could see Lila's careful crayon markings. "It turns out I had plenty left undone. I'd forgotten how peach pie, made from scratch, could taste like a summer afternoon in 1955. I'd forgotten the simple joy of seeing the world from the top of a Ferris wheel. I'd forgotten that lakes hold memories as well as water, and that sometimes the best conversations are the ones you have with people who can only hear you with their hearts." Several people in the room wiped their eyes, understanding that John was talking about more than tourist attractions and favorite foods. "But most importantly," John continued, looking directly at Robert, "I'd forgotten that it's never too late to say you're sorry, and it's never too late to come home." Robert nodded, his own eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "Now," John said, settling back into his chair, but keeping his coffee cup raised, "I want to tell you about my 10th wish, the one I saved for last because it was the most important." The room grew quiet with the particular attention people give to moments they instinctively understand. They'll want to remember. "My final wish," John said, "was to see all of you, my family, my friends, the people who've made my life worth living, and to tell you something important. Don't wait until you're 90 to make your lists. Don't wait until you're facing the end to figure out what matters. Don't wait for a 7-year-old girl to remind you that life is for living, not just surviving." He paused, looking around the room at faces he'd known for decades and faces that represented the future he wouldn't live to see. "Make your lists now," he said firmly. "Dream your dreams now. Have the conversations that need having. Take the trips that call to your heart. Eat the pie that reminds you of your grandmother's kitchen. Love the people in your life so thoroughly that when it's time to say goodbye, you'll have no regrets about what was left unsaid or undone." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that holds truth like a cupped hand holding water. The real birthday party happened the following Saturday, not because anyone needed time to prepare. The decorations were still in Sarah's closet from the first party, but because John wanted Robert to stay long enough to really be there, not just present in body, but settled into the family rhythm he'd been missing. The second party was smaller, but somehow more complete. The same neighbors came, the same friends from the hardware store, but this time John wasn't the reluctant center of attention. This time he was the host of his own celebration. When everyone had gathered in the living room, squeezed onto couches and folding chairs, and in the case of the youngest grandchildren, cross-legged on the carpet, John stood slowly and raised his coffee cup instead of a champagne flute, because coffee was what Margaret would have served at a Saturday afternoon gathering. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally figured out what he wanted to say. "A month ago, when my family threw me a party, I kept insisting I didn't want. I thought I was too old for surprises, too old for new experiences, too old for lists and wishes and dreams." He looked at Lila, who was sitting on the floor beside his chair, with her notebook open to a fresh page, ready to record whatever important thing was about to happen. "But this little girl asked me a question that changed everything. She asked me what 10 things I still wanted to do, and at first I thought the answer was nothing. What could a 90-year-old man possibly have left undone?" He pulled the original napkin from his shirt pocket, carefully preserved despite weeks of folding and unfolding, and held it up so everyone could see Lila's careful crayon markings. "It turns out I had plenty left undone. I'd forgotten how peach pie, made from scratch, could taste like a summer afternoon in 1955. I'd forgotten the simple joy of seeing the world from the top of a Ferris wheel. I'd forgotten that lakes hold memories as well as water, and that sometimes the best conversations are the ones you have with people who can only hear you with their hearts." Several people in the room wiped their eyes, understanding that John was talking about more than tourist attractions and favorite foods. "But most importantly," John continued, looking directly at Robert, "I'd forgotten that it's never too late to say you're sorry, and it's never too late to come home." Robert nodded, his own eyes bright with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "Now," John said, settling back into his chair, but keeping his coffee cup raised, "I want to tell you about my 10th wish, the one I saved for last because it was the most important." The room grew quiet with the particular attention people give to moments they instinctively understand. They'll want to remember. "My final wish," John said, "was to see all of you, my family, my friends, the people who've made my life worth living, and to tell you something important. Don't wait until you're 90 to make your lists. Don't wait until you're facing the end to figure out what matters. Don't wait for a 7-year-old girl to remind you that life is for living, not just surviving." He paused, looking around the room at faces he'd known for decades and faces that represented the future he wouldn't live to see. "Make your lists now," he said firmly. "Dream your dreams now. Have the conversations that need having. Take the trips that call to your heart. Eat the pie that reminds you of your grandmother's kitchen. Love the people in your life so thoroughly that when it's time to say goodbye, you'll have no regrets about what was left unsaid or undone." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that holds truth like a cupped hand holding water.